Okay, so what is it like being the wife of a sex addict who isn't ready to get into recovery yet?
Being the wife of a sex addict, period, is really difficult. It's hard, you feel alone, you feel crazy. And especially if the addict isn't ready to get help yet, you may feel powerless, hopeless, like, what am I going to do? I can't continue to live my life like this. And there really is a lot that you can do, even if the addict doesn't get help. And I think that's the point that I really want to bring home is that for the wives, there's so much support and so much help to get you ready to make whatever decisions you need to make about the relationship. So sometimes the addict will, say you're crazy, I'm not an addict, I just slipped or I just needed some excitement. But you as the wife know, you kind of have that gut instinct that there's something more, or you have found so many things that it's impossible for it to just be, a little bit of a problem. So I think it's really important, to know that there is help for you, even though the sex addict doesn't want to get help. And a lot of wives struggle with the concept of them being the ones that get the help because they're like, well, I'm not the one with the problem. He's the one with the problem. And you're right. He's the one with the problem, but his problem has affected you. And, with a therapist, in therapy, we kind of unpack in what ways it's affected you. And really, at the end of the day, you don't need to live in a shameful, secretive, type of marriage where you're in a lot of emotional pain and you have to, put a smile on and pretend to be happy and that everything's okay. You just don't need to do that anymore.
What is one thing that you'd like wives to know?
Well, there's definitely more than one. But I think one of the most important things is that they're not alone. Sex addiction is so rampant in our society that there are thousands, if not, hundreds of thousands of wives that are struggling with the same exact thing and no one's talking about it. I can't tell you how many women I see that, they're terrified, and rightfully so, of talking to their girlfriends about their husband, cheating or watching pornography or, going to massage parlors. And if women, I think, were to open up a little bit more with, their friends, they would see that they're not alone. So that's one thing that I think is really important that, you look at if you have 10 friends, 10 women friends, at least 5 or 6 of them have struggled in one way or another with infidelity in their marriage. Maybe not all of the men are sex addicts, but they know what it's like to be betrayed. So just getting that support is very helpful to women. Another thing that I think is really important that women know is that even though the addict is the one with the problem that can be really seen, it's affected the wives, it's affected you in a way that you also would benefit from getting the help. So even if, your husband or spouse or boyfriend doesn't want to get the help, you can understand what addiction is. And the other thing that I think is really, really important for women to know, and I'll probably talk about this a little later in another clip, is that it's not your fault. It's not your fault. You couldn't have more sex, be nicer, look prettier. There's nothing that you could possibly do to stop your partner from going outside of the marriage, because addiction isn't about sex. It isn't about the partner. It's about the person struggling with the addiction escaping reality, whatever their reality is, or escaping trauma from the past. So one of the challenges that wives can face while their husbands are active in sex addiction is an incredible amount of shame and feeling that it's their fault. Another challenge that they face is the secrecy, right? Having to present in front of their children, if they have kids, or in front of their families, that everything is, okay in their relationship, because they're really afraid of what are other people going to think if they know that my husband is a sex addict, or if they know that my husband is unfaithful and I choose to stay in the relationship. And this is something that a lot of women struggle with, right? They're not ready to leave. They don't want to leave. So they don't tell anyone because they don't want to be seen as stupid, as weak, as, not having the courage to leave the relationship. And they will get a lot of that feedback from their friends and families if they do expose what's really going on in their relationship. And another challenge that women face is that women sometimes have a hard time reaching out to other women, especially other women that they don't know. So they have a hard time going into the support for women of addicts, which there's a ton of. There's a program called S-Anon, which is specifically for that. It's for partners of sex addicts. And that's a challenge for a lot of women, is picking up that phone or going to that, first 12-step meeting. So these are all some challenges that women face when they're married to a sex addict.
What are some of the challenges that women face when their husbands are in recovery from sex addiction?
Well, that's a whole other topic, and I'm glad we're addressing it, because a lot of times the husband goes into recovery and the woman feels that they don't need recovery, they don't need therapy, it's the husband's problem, he'll go and deal with it. The issue with that type of thinking is, let's say the husband does go in recovery and, he's doing awesome and he's working his steps. His mindset is really going to shift to that of a spiritual, holistic, coming into self, rigorous honesty. They're going to be talking a different language. And what happens is, if the addict is talking one language and the wife is talking another language, that's going to cause issues in the relationship. So one reason that it's important for the partner to, go into some type of recovery also is so that they can talk in the same language to each other. Another obstacle that they have is the addict, especially at the beginning, is going to need to devote an enormous amount of time to their recovery. And what I mean by that is, going to their therapy, going to their meetings, dealing with triggers, dealing with, traumatic events from their past and thoughts from their past. And the wife may say, well, you haven't been home, our entire marriage, or you've been abandoning me our entire marriage. And now you're, technically sober and you're still not home, or you're still not available. So the partner really needs to also understand that the addict needs this time to get as healthy as he can so that he can be available. And if both people are in their own recovery, then all of this can be managed and explained as we, go through it. Another challenge that a wife can face once their husband is in recovery is relapse. Relapse is very common in sex addiction recovery. It doesn't have to be, but it's common. And I'll explain what I mean by relapse. There's something called the 3 circles, and that's whether you're in therapy or 12-step programs, we all kind of have this concept where there's this inner circle, which is what the addict is absolutely abstaining from. So that's, massage parlors, escorts, prostitutes. And then there's these middle circles where it's fringe behavior. Now, an addict may stay sober from massage parlors and escorts, but they may really struggle with masturbation if that's in their inner circle, or slipping on pornography. So it's not the end of the world, and we don't treat it as the end of the world, because they're abstinent from their primary drug of choice, if we want to call it that. So having the partner understand that my husband's relapsing on pornography, although he hasn't gone to escorts in 3 or 6 months. Now, eventually the goal is to be abstinent from everything that's in that person's inner circle, and every addict's inner circle is going to be different. Sex addiction recovery is not cookie cutter for the addict or for the wives. It's very individualized to each person and each person's past. So that's another struggle that wives can face in recovery, in the addict's recovery, is when the addict relapses, and how do you address it? Boundaries is also something that a wife can struggle with in recovery. Learning the difference between what's a boundary and what's control. Or are you enabling the sex addict? Or are you trying to control the sex addict? Or are you really setting a boundary that's going to keep you safe? So these are just a couple of the issues that wives can deal with when the husband is in recovery.
So could you speak to the role of trauma in the lives of wives of sex addicts?
So I think 99% of people, right, addicts, not addicts, have some sort of trauma in their past, right? Therapists call it big T's or little t's, big traumas or little traumas. It's kind of hard to grow up and escape some form, escaping trauma in general. So, as a wife of a sex addict, when we start going back into your own life and looking at big traumas or little traumas that you have had, it's important because on top of whatever you've had going on in your own life, way before you met the addict, now you're also traumatized by the betrayal of the sex addict. Now, when the wife of the sex addict comes into therapy, we don't immediately want to focus on, oh, well, you have all this trauma and that's what we want to work on. Because then they could feel, I know I would feel like, wait, I'm here because my husband's a sex addict. I'm in distress. I'm falling apart. I don't want to talk about my past. I'm here for a specific reason because he brought me here or he pushed me to come here. And we're going to address that. You know, when I have a wife sitting in front of me, one of the first things that I want to address, acknowledge is how brave, how brave and courageous and resilient they have been in dealing with weeks, months, years of living with a sex addict or being in a relationship with a sex addict, because it's really hard. It's harder to stay in the relationship than it is to leave. Leaving is pretty easy. But if you've stayed in this relationship time and time again, betrayal after betrayal, that really needs to be recognized, that there is so much resilience and bravery and courage inside of the wife. And that's what we're going to work on. Eventually, I like to go back to some of your old stuff because sometimes our old stuff plays into the present. One of the patterns that I've seen, and this does not happen with all wives, but I've seen it in several of the wives of sex addicts, especially if it's their second or third marriage or they've had a lot of relationships in the past. When we start going down the list of their either previous marriages or previous relationships, usually what we find is that the men in these women's lives have been somewhat, either they've been addicts, maybe alcoholics or drug addicts, but most of them, if not all, have been emotionally unavailable, right? They attach to these emotionally unavailable men. So one of the things that we also want to explore is, okay, well, what's going on that maybe I need to work on so that I don't continue this pattern? But again, that happens down the road. The first thing that I want to stress when I'm in front of a wife of a sex addict is that it takes an incredible amount of courage to stay in a relationship and an incredible amount of resilience because it's not easy.
So what do you recommend that a wife do to heal?
So the first thing I recommend is for her to find a therapist that is in her community that is specifically trained as a sex addiction therapist, or an addiction therapist, if it's substance abuse, but someone that is trained in helping partners of addicts. The other thing, I'm a certified sex addiction therapist, so I work under the Patrick Carnes model, and I use the partner side of the program, which is about healing for the wives of sex addicts. So we work out of a workbook called Facing Heartbreak, and the other one is called Mending a Shattered Heart. So it really explains addiction. A lot of wives, when they come in, they have no clue about what addiction is, or they don't buy it. They say addiction is just an excuse. So it's really important for her recovery and for the addict's recovery, if the addict is going to heal, that we really understand that addiction is real. It's not some, made up thing. It's not an excuse. The addict's behaviors are never going to be excused, right? They did what they did, and they need to be accountable for that behavior, and they need to repair and make amends for that behavior. And I know myself as a therapist, I'm always going to hold them to the fire for that. However, it does need to be understood that it is a disease of the brain, and there is a certain component that's an obsession and a compulsion that they can't help unless they get the treatment for it. So when the partner is really educated on that, the levels of success for the couple are much, much higher. So a lot of women that I work with at the very beginning there's a lot of distress around, how could I have not known this was happening, right under my nose? And this question really breaks my heart all the time because they really put it on themselves. that they're stupid, that they were ignorant, that what's wrong with them, maybe I wasn't available enough, maybe I wasn't a good enough wife, maybe I wasn't paying attention. And it really does hurt me because this is not their fault, at all. It's not your fault. I always say you get married, and I'm a woman, so, I had that illusion of getting married with my best friend, trusting that we were there for each other, that we would never hurt each other, that we were always going to be honest with each other. And that's how we should go into the marriage. We shouldn't go into the marriage doubting and searching and looking and not trusting. So I tell these wives, you were doing exactly what you were supposed to do. You're supposed to trust your husband. You're supposed to believe in them. You're not supposed to be searching. So you didn't do anything wrong. There was no way that you could have known that something was going on until you found out. And if you find it and get into a fight with them and make up and stay and then do it again, that's a different story. And that story is, I don't want to believe it, right? I really, really want to believe that my husband is being honest when he says, I'm not doing it again. Because usually they are at that moment. They are being honest and saying, I'm not doing it again. They don't want to do it again. They don't want to hurt you. But the addiction takes over. Addiction is a hijacking of the brain. And when that brain is hijacked, let me tell you, they don't care about wives, about kids, about job. They don't care about anything. So I never, ever want a wife to think that she's stupid or she wasn't paying attention or that she did something wrong. This isn't about you doing something wrong. This is about you going into a marriage exactly the way you were supposed to go, and then this illness coming into your marriage and taking over your marriage and learning how to deal with it in the best way. But I really don't want any wife out there to ever think that they could have done something differently to change the course of their marriage. Because what they're going to do differently is right now, right? After you see these videos, after you read information, that's what you can do differently. I always say, once you ring the bell, you can't unring it. So once you get all this information, then it's going to be harder to stay in the relationship and keep on going, on that merry-go-round and pretending it's not there because you've already heard the information. So, that's really what I think about these women that say it's my fault or I should have known. So one of the many concerns that I get from wives when they come to me, and especially if they find pornography on their husband's computer or on their phone, is sometimes the content of the pornography that they're finding. So, I've had wives that find teenage girls on porn. They're not actually teenagers, they're 18, but they are dressing up like teenagers, or they're in the role of a teenager. And a lot of times they're afraid. The wives are afraid. Does that mean he's a pedophile? Does it mean, he's into, little girls? And not necessarily so. Being a sex addict doesn't mean you're a sex offender. It can, but that's not what we're talking about in most cases. So fantasies are normal, everyone has them. And it's actually a very common fantasy for men to fantasize about younger women, about barely legal, 16, 17, 18. Actually, in a lot of these porn websites, that's one of the number one searches on the engine. So it doesn't necessarily mean that they're into, younger girls or that they would ever act out with someone underage. And when they're in recovery from sex addiction, the sex addict is really going to explore what is it about the content that they're watching that's arousing. For some men, looking at these younger girls gives them a sense of power, a sense of youth, a sense of control. It could be, multiple things. But at the end of the day, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're predators or that they're going to become sex offenders or that they would even actually have sex with someone that's, under the age of 18. It just may mean that that's something that's arousing to them for a million other reasons. Another content that can come up on some men's, search in pornography is other males, right? So it's gay porn or transvestite, images or scenes. And that, women really, and rightfully so, freak out when they see that. Is my husband gay? Does that mean that he's gay? And again, it doesn't necessarily mean that the male is gay because he's watching gay porn or because he's watching transvestite, pornography. Sexuality is on a continuum, and we have to remember that the way that the male brain views sex is going to be very different than the way the female brain views sex. So for some men, and especially with pornography, where there's really a tolerance, and that tolerance needs to increase and increase and increase to get the same arousal, sometimes these men end up seeing things on porn that they would have never started with. It's just that the normal stuff that they were watching at the beginning isn't giving them that hit, that excitement, that arousal anymore. So again, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're gay. It can, but I don't want, a woman to see gay porn on their husband's computer and, say that's it, they're gay, this whole marriage has been a fraud. It doesn't always mean that. So a lot of women, when they come, one of the things that causes them a lot of shame, even to sometimes bring up this question, is about possible STDs, right? So if you have found that your husband is seeing escorts, seeing prostitutes, going to massage parlors, having one-night stands or having affairs, you really do want to take care of yourself and go to your OBGYN and get tested for STDs, because this is about your life, right? It's really about you self-caring and you protecting yourself. And a lot of OBGYNs, you don't have to tell them all of the specifics. You could really just say, I want to have, an STD workup. Me and my husband are, having some difficulties, and I think there may be something going on. But it's really your right to get checked. It's your responsibility, because it's your body to get checked, make sure that, that you're okay, and to tell your husband, we're not going to have sex until these results come back. Or if you are going to have sex, we're going to use a condom. And again, because the trust is broken. And this is something that can affect you. The last thing that we want to do is get an STD. And a lot of women do get STDs because of their husbands acting out. Because either they didn't know that the husband was acting out, or they knew and they didn't really think it was that big of a deal, or they just really, it's a form of denial, right? It's not going to happen to me. It's very painful to think about this specific topic, because it could be shameful for a lot of women to contract an STD when it wasn't even them, the ones acting out. So please, do yourself a favor, put yourself as a priority. And if you know that your husband has been acting out sexually, get tested. There's two types of sex addicts when they get caught by the partner or when they get confronted by the partner. There's the one type that is very remorseful, and they are, very empathetic and very willing to do whatever it takes. I'm sorry, I'll do whatever you want. Please don't leave. I don't know what I was thinking. You're right. And those usually, come into therapy, and we start working, and, happily ever after. Not quite, but it works out pretty well. And then there's the other type of addict that does not show any remorse, right? That says you're crazy, or, I just did it one time, get over it. All men are doing this. But the woman can feel that there's no validation, there's no empathy, there's no remorse. And that's even harder for the woman, because not only has the husband betrayed them sexually, but now they don't even care, so then the woman really feels alone. And with those, unless they are narcissistic, right, like a true personality disorder, usually they can have some narcissistic traits, but also they're terrified. They are so afraid and so much shame around what they've done that the only way they can protect themselves is by putting it on you, right? By getting angry at you, by minimizing what you're going through. And those are definitely tougher to work with. We could still work with them if the partner stays strong, right? If the woman stays strong, which is it's a tall order, because it's very hard when I've already been hurt by the person that I love, and then they're hurting me again by minimizing what I'm feeling or what I'm experiencing. So with those, I say just, keep going and stay strong. And again, sometimes the woman needs to come into therapy before the addict ever gets into therapy. So a lot of times partners, will tell me that they're, They don't want to keep searching. They don't want to keep looking for things, on their addict's phone or have a tracker or any of that stuff. And if they really don't want any of that information, then we're going to go with that. But then there's other women that having that information, having passwords, having, trackers, having the Find My iPhone on is really important and crucial to their recovery, especially in the first year. So I always tell the addicts that I work with, we're going to give your wives full access for a year. And if you're not doing anything wrong and you're in recovery, then this shouldn't be a problem. But it really helps the woman kind of, the way that it goes is the woman gets into fear, right? Let's say this example I'm giving is your husband's in recovery, right? He's been in recovery for a month, you're sitting at home, and all of a sudden you get almost like a panic attack of, what if he's doing something? He's not home yet. Where could he be? And sometimes they'll turn the iPhone on and they'll see, oh, he's a block away. Or they'll open up, the bank account and see, okay, all the transactions are, valid. There's nothing, fishy. Or they'll go into the phone and see what was on the search history, right? Because the addict isn't clearing the search history. And they don't find anything, right? There's nothing there. When we add up enough of those experiences, then the wife's trauma and anxiety begins to go down because they really start seeing, I keep looking and there's nothing there. My husband really is doing what he needs to do. So I always encourage addicts to really give that access to their wives in that first year. It's not like you're going to have it forever, right? Because at some point we do have to build trust. That's the point of this, is to build that trust. But I also have to recognize that you've been traumatized and that you need that extra help and handholding at the beginning to be able to gain that trust. Now, if your husbands are adamant that they do not want you to have this stuff, then I work with the husband and say, what's going on? Because then it's really the husband being able to have empathy for what you've gone through and realize that now it's their turn to help you. So it's not really about them. It's about, are you, as the sex addict and as the husband who has traumatized your wife because of your own disease, are you willing to help her through her process? And usually when it's worded that way, if the person really isn't acting out, I haven't had an issue with the addict saying, have all of my stuff. You could have it all. You could check. I'm not doing anything. And I've also had, the experience that women may check for, a couple months, and then they say, I haven't even checked his phone in 2 months, or I haven't, looked at the bank account in 3 months, because they start feeling. So another question that I get asked is couples that the man seems to not be able to get an erection when they are being intimate with their wives, but then the wives, see all this porn or see them going, to escorts. And that's actually pretty common. There's something called porn-induced erectile dysfunction. And because of the high intensity of the porn, there's no way that they're going to be able to get an erection with their wives, not because their wives aren't attractive, but because stimulating, they're so used to a certain type of stimulation that unless they're stimulated in that specific way, they won't be able to have an erection. Other men don't have an erection because of the amount of shame. They feel so much guilt when they are with their wives, knowing that they have been with escorts or prostitutes or having sex outside of the marriage, that it really affects them in the bedroom with their wives, and they won't be able to get an erection because they're in their head. So either a porn-induced erectile dysfunction or shame is very common for these men to not be able to have an erection when they're having sex with their wives. So most importantly, it's not a problem with you, right? If the man is not having an erection while you guys are having sex, that's not a direct result of you. It's something else going on with them. And that's also something that's very hard for women to believe. So they need to hear it from other women. They need to hear it from someone that they trust, whether it's their therapist or other women, that, hey, this happens to me too. I mean, I have seen countless couples where the man and wife are having a great sex life, and the husband is going outside of the marriage and acting out into sex addiction. So it really doesn't have to do with the actual sex that the person is having. So a lot of people ask me, what my experience is when I'm working with them, and I always start off first and foremost with obviously my professional experience, where I've been working with addicts in general for, about 15 years, and sex addicts specifically for like the last 10. But also something that I think is really important, and I do, self-disclose in my sessions, is I can see it from both sides. I'm an addict in recovery from substance abuse, and I'm also married to a sex addict in recovery. So I can, really empathize with the addict, and I could also empathize with the wife. And I think that's really important sometimes in me bonding with my clients, because they know that I really get it. I get it from a knowledge base and an intellectual base, but I also get it from a feeling base. I remember being pregnant, being 3-4 months pregnant and giving my husband that ultimatum of either you get therapy or that's it, this is done, and ironically, I was in the middle of getting trained to be a sex addiction therapist, while this happened. And, he did go into recovery and he was willing. So I know from firsthand that there is hope as to what can happen when both people are willing, because he had to do his work, I had to do my work. And, here we are 11 years later, and we've worked for 11 years. It wasn't we went to therapy for a little bit and that's it. We keep unpeeling our onions, right? It's like we're both onions and we try to get to the core. And even though there have been, good times and bad times, there's always been communication, there's been trust, and we have both been willing, to work on each other, to work on ourselves. But I can understand when a wife says, I feel betrayed, or I can't get the images, out of my mind, or how hard it is when there is a relapse to not shame the addict even more. And I think these are all things that are important, for the wives to know that there is hope, and that there is a path to intimacy, and that you can return to intimacy, which is, the whole purpose of our program is to get wives, to get husbands that struggle with addiction to be able to return to an intimacy that works for them. And, another thing I think that really is important is that any therapist that if you guys choose to, do any of this work with our team, is all of our therapists are obviously, trained, and some of them are certified sex addiction therapists as well. But they also bring that personal component where they have struggled with some sort of addiction, whether it's substance abuse, sex addiction, codependency. So they get it on an internal level that this is a process and that this is, it's challenging, to do on their own. So one of the things that's important is, and a lot of people ask, is the why, right? Why is my husband a sex addict? And that's a very long, answer. I'm going to try to kind of shorten it for the purpose of this video. But at the core, addiction is an intimacy disorder. So somewhere in the addict's life, early on in the family, it's what we call like there was a break in attachment, right? And once the addict realizes that they can find relief through this activity, right? Through sex, or if it's another addiction, through alcohol or food or drugs, their brain kind of makes that connection of if I'm in pain, if I'm sad, if I'm stressed out, if I feel alone, if any feeling, any negative feeling, they're going to attach it to their acting out behavior, in this case, sex. So when we're working with addiction, we go back to what that family of origin was like. And I work from kind of like the basis of we have many parts, and the addict is one part of the person, and that part developed as the purpose of that part was to protect that little boy, right? And protect that little boy from feeling pain, from feeling alone. And at the moment, it was a good idea and it was brilliant because it kept them from doing things that may harm them even more. But after a while, obviously it has consequences. But the why is that this is, it's a brain disease, but it's also a, psychological that goes back to family of origin. And in our therapy, in the process, we start unpacking what feelings was the addict trying to medicate from very early on. So we take a detailed sexual history starting from as far back as the addict can remember. Some of them can remember having sexual experiences or being exposed to sex or sexuality as young as the age of 3. So it's a process, but it goes back to family of origin, relationships, connections that were either made or not made, and this way of coping that they've been using their whole lives to deal with emotional pain.